This video is done in collaboration with Henry the Paleo Guy, ATR1X_, Curious Archive, Spino Dude Reviews, and Some Raptor. Check out their channels via links in the description and comment section below. Low poly models in this video were made by Adam Midzuk or Kuzim. They were animated by Cameron, Camzilla94, and by Nyx. Sauropods, or longnecks, were the largest things to ever walk the face of the earth. Nothing else has come close. Whether that's because something evolves to curb them before they reach the same size as the long-necked dinosaurs, or that the sauropods were just built different, the fact remains that nothing existed before or after them that could compete. The only critters to beat out the land titans are the oceanic leviathans. But that's water. They're cheating. Each new sauropod dinosaur discovered helps to understand the group as a whole, as every single one is fragmentary, with very few considered relatively complete. One of these well-preserved behemoths was yet another South American beast from the Late Cretaceous. Come and join me in learning about one of the most complete of the titanosaurs, Dreadnoughtus, the living citadel. Controversy over the mass weight. The team that first described the remains used a weight equation from a 2012 paper by Campion and Evans. This equation, Equation 1, lets you estimate the body mass of a quadrupedal animal using only the circumference of the humerus and the femur. This is, on its face, especially useful for fossil specimens that only preserve their humerus and femur. With this equation, the research team got a mass of 59 tons. Sauropod paleontologist Dr. Matt Waddell quickly got around to a rebuttal towards this estimation a few days after the paper was published on the blog Sauropod Vertebra Picture of the Week, which he co-runs with Drs. Darren Naish and Mike Taylor. Dr. Waddell states that this value is presumably a middle-of-the-road estimate that the equation provided. This is because a 95% confidence interval would mean that the animal could have been anywhere between 40 and 80 tons, or perhaps an even wider range. That's obviously
no good.
Dr. Waddell then looked to see if the published 59 tons was even plausible for Dreadnoughtus to begin with. He used graphic double integration. This method was originally invented back in the 70s to estimate the volumes of cranial endocasts, which are sediment casts of the brain case. This technique is easy. You cut a 3D organism into slices, compute the average cross-sectional area of each body part, multiply that by the length of the body part in question, and add up the results. This method was originally applied to whole animal bodies in 1999. You also need different perspective views of the animal's body: top, front, bottom, side. Dr. Waddell used both the profile view skeletal reconstruction provided with the original paper and different views afforded by the 3D scanned skeleton also provided by the original paper. Once Dr. Waddell did all the maths and added everything up, he got a Dreadnoughtus of 57 cubic meters of volume, so about 57 tons. That isn't far off from the figured 59-ton mass of the paper. Unfortunately, a new problem emerged. This value is assuming that all body parts of Dreadnoughtus were generally round in cross-section, but a lot of sauropods had distinctly non-round body cross-sections. The necks of apatosaurs were damn near rectangular. A lot of titanosaur rib cages bulged out to the sides like crazy, and some sauropods had really tall and flat tails. To assume that Dreadnoughtus had a circular body cross-section may inflate the mass. Another but comes in here. This is assuming sauropods were as dense as water. But based on their bones, they were far less dense. Sauropods were some of the airiest animals to ever walk on land. Sauropod bodies were frickin' weird. I referenced before that some sauropods were wide-gauged and narrow-gauged in their hip structures and how close their limbs were to the midline of their bodies. This distinction carries over to their bodies as well. Some sauropods were just straight-up tacos, others were corn dogs, yet more were bricks. Let me show you what I mean. Here is a cross-section of a diplodocus. It is a vertebra from the back and accompanying ribs. An important thing to note here is that the ribs of sauropods largely bent down from their connection to the vertebra. As you can see in these ribs from a mammal, the ribs arch up and out before coming down to form the body walls. Here in this comparative diagram of ribs from a Uromastix, monitor lizard, iguana, and croc, reptiles have ribs that stick out of their vertebrae sideways before arching down to form the body walls. This then makes the orientation of the ribs and how they form the body walls quite strange in the sauropods. Diplodocus and its relatives were tacos. Their body walls were tall and thin comparatively. Then you have your hot dogs, usually heftier beasts like the macronarians, brachiosaurs, and chimerosaurs. We are hot dogs too, so are cows, and they even become them too. The titanosaurs were just bricks. This is the cross-section of the obnoxiously named Opisthocoelocadia. Taking our attention back to Dr. Weddell and the Dreadnoughtus bod, a rounded cross-section to the torso is acceptable. Where it becomes less believable, according to Dr. Weddell, is in the neck and tail. Given the benefit of the doubt required for muscles, the tail and neck could not have been entirely circular in cross-section according to every view of the fossils available. Dr. Weddell speculated a width-to-height ratio of at least 2 to 3, so body and limbs circular, neck and tail not circular. Got it. Now what does it all mean? Taking the calculations of volume for the animal with the math that would also take into account the air-filled voids of sauropod bones, plus the circular cross-sections of the body and limbs and non-circular cross-sections of the neck and tail, Dr. Weddell found that a more accurate mass estimate for the larger Dreadnoughtus to be between 35 and 40 tons. Dr. Mike Taylor commented on this article by Dr. Weddell, providing some welcome take-home messages for anyone reading, listening, learning, and trying to understand the science of it all. Dr. Taylor says,
"What this really tells us is not that either you or Dr. Lacovera and team got this wrong, but that using two different approaches to mass estimation gives results that differ by 57%, and that also needn't mean that one of the methods is better than the other, but that they are telling us different things. Dr. Lacovera and team's work tells us that Dreadnoughtus has limbs whose robustness is appropriate for a 59-ton animal. You tell us that, in fact, it likely massed less than 2/3 of that. So, it was probably somewhat more athletic than we would usually expect for an animal of its size. We can deduce this from seeing where the actual mass falls relative to the regression line. But if you get your mass estimation from the regression line, then by definition you can't make such deductions. That's why I consider mass estimates from limb-bone allometry less than satisfactory. Obviously, for a lot of extinct animals, they're the only estimate we're ever going to get, and it's good to have them on that basis. But when we have sufficiently complete remains, I'd always rather see a volumetric estimate.
Proportions. Dr. Matt Weddell wrote about the proportions of Dreadnoughtus as they are illustrated in the original paper. The original skeletal reconstruction shows the animal with a long torso. This is comparatively, of course. This was all due to Dr. Weddell reconfiguring the lengths of the individual vertebra by using the lengths of just the centrum of the vertebra, plus consideration of the width of cartilage between the bones. With that, Dr. Weddell found the torso should be 20% shorter. This results in a much shorter looking torso than was originally figured. Once you put the two skeletals next to each other, you begin to really understand what 20% can do to a body. The OG does look a bit wiener doggy. This shortening of the torso also results in a modification of the animal's estimated weight, which I will get to in due time. Further nonsense about mass. Aside from Dr. Weddell and his SV POW pals' response to the Dreadnoughtus paper, many other researchers took a crack at the hard-to-accept original mass estimate. Gregory S. Paul, talented paleoartist, researcher, notoriously hard to photograph, professional little guy, took the next crack at this conundrum. In his published rebuttal, he states,
"To correctly restore mass for a given, at least fairly complete, specimen, especially for an extinct species without close living analogs or relatives, requires a rigorous skeletal and total volume restoration based on modern techniques. Also of great utility when comparing masses between specimens and species is comparisons of volumes derived from high-quality restorations constructed using consistent criteria."
Unfortunately, Paul goes on to suggest one of the methods you can use to get accurate reconstructions of the bones to use as a basis for volume calculations, and thus mass. I say unfortunately, as though it definitely has its merit and can be used effectively in many contexts, it seems like it would allow a higher percentage of human error than other methods. As Paul states,
Using standard tracing techniques to digitized efforts involving laser scannings of the fossil bones, the first is not necessarily less accurate than the latter because achieving correct proportions is merely a matter of paying due attention. Using laser scan results to then produce a hand tracing ensures accurate results, unless major human error intrudes.
Paul then brings up a great point that Dr. Weddell brought up and is probably the biggest issue among laypeople regarding the biggest of the dinosaurs.
Artistic license when it comes to the application of muscles and fat to appendages does not, as many presume, have a major impact in variable results in restoring mass for a given specimen. In sauropods, even the often very large necks make up less of the total mass than it may visually appear because they were highly pneumatic.
Sauropods may look absolutely gigantic, and they were, but that gigantism doesn't have to equal masses surpassing the physical limits of animal biology. Those necks and tails were the least heavy parts of the body, as they didn't have huge heavy digestive tracts running through them, nor were they really carrying anything other than, well, themselves. The entire skeleton of the dinosaurs was invaded by hollowed spaces, hence the descriptive hollow bones. Some dinosaurs had more or less hollow bones, and most had hollower or solider bones in certain parts of their bodies. For the sauropods, their necks and tails were the hollowest, with the most invasion of hollow air sacs. This can be observed from the outside in how all of the neck bones tend to look like, well, it's hard to find a comparison. They look a little bit like all the spindly bits and suspensions we have used to make our bridges. And they kinda look a little like a tesseract if all the bits of the tesseract were hollow, so you just had bars reinforcing a central unit. I'm sure there are better descriptive comparisons to be made, but alas, I'm one feller. Gregory S. Paul suggests that the measurements were accurate and agreed with the bones that were scanned and recombobulated into a 3D model. This guy. But both the measurements and the scanned bones don't match up as well with the 2D side profile skeletal reconstruction, the one Dr. Weddell fixed by shortening the ribcage a tad. Old Greg ends up with a mass estimate of 45 tons when he used the femur as a key measurement for mass. Then he got 29 tons when he scaled the skeletal reconstruction to the correct length of the back vertebrae. Paul made his own reconstruction of Dreadnoughtus based on his calculations, and it ends up looking a lot more like other known titanosaurs. His Dreadnoughtus had a little taller of a shoulder than the OG reconstruction. Paul notes here that another error in the first reconstruction is that they arched the back vertebrae too tightly. Titanosaurs either had a gently arched back or nearly straight. Here, as well, the neck and tail are thinner, thus making their cross-sections different and aligning more with what Dr. Weddell and company were finding. A year or so later, another group of researchers took a crack at Dreadnoughtus' size. At this point, I'm starting to think it doesn't matter too much. Size doesn't really matter, right guys? It's how you use it. Anyway, doctors Carl Bates, Peter Falkingham, Sophie McCulley, Charlotte Brassey, and Susanna Maidment published their own study on changing up the size of Dreadnoughtus to match reality a bit better. They made this ugly, but oh so practical digital volumetric model of Dreadnoughtus using the digitized skeleton as a base. Just for shits and giggles, or like comparisons or something, the team also made volumetric models of 6 living critters: 3 pájaros, 2 cocodrilos, y uno lagarto, plus 2 extinky fellers, Giraffa Titan and Apatosaurus. Anyone else ever forget if it's Giraffa Titan or Giraffa Titan? Probably just a me thing. They T-posed all of the models for better comparison and divided them up into their body part segments: head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Oh wait, no, it was head, neck, trunk, tail, thigh, shank, foot, humerus, forearm, and hand, like a bionicle. The figure caption here is a little hard to read, but based on what I'm seeing, it seems like the top one here is just the base model, and B is also the base model. And then C here is the base model with an added 21% extra volume, and then D is the maximal volume before it starts getting cartoony. Based on their math, this team found that the regular model came out to about 22 tons. The 21% extra was 27 tons, and the big fat boy Slim here was a whole 38 tons. So this test using these alternate methods came up with similar masses to Dr. Weddell and Paul's work. All of these alternate tests have been consistent and consistently lower than the original 59-ton estimate. The team's work, comparing the simple scaling equations from the first paper to a volumetric approach that made extra room for the respiratory system, found that using the scaling equation approach unintentionally resulted in the animal having an impossible amount of bulk. Too much fat, skin, muscle, and more. That's where the heft would have come from if it were accurate. After this newer 2015 study was published, Dr. Lacovera expressed skepticism of the downsize, stating, "The method of measuring the skeleton and using it to estimate mass is based on the observation in living animals that, from a biomechanical standpoint, animals have the limbs they need, no more and no less. This newer study is therefore positing Dreadnoughtus as an exception to the rule. It would mean the beast had massively sturdy limbs its frame didn't really need to hold up an assumedly smaller mass. You usually need to apply alternate mass estimation techniques to finds that are poorly preserved. Dreadnoughtus is not such a find, so the aversion to the traditional mass estimation techniques was odd to Dr. Lacovera. The Dreadnoughtus specimens have all the bones needed to estimate a mass from just a simple formula. Dr. Lacovera was not so sure that you could even estimate the volume of an animal's skin based on the number of bones they found of Dreadnoughtus. In their original paper, Dr. Lacovera and his team were pretty clear about how uncertain they were of the overall size of the skeleton. If any of these uncertain variables were tweaked, Lacovera explained, the volume would change.
Some artists make dinosaurs look chubby, some make them look like they're shrink crabs. Volume just isn't preserved in the fossil record, and that's what they're using. Historically, scientists have worked with the data that exists, which is a pretty good policy. If I was making a new method, I'd apply it to as many skeletons, and more complete ones than ours, as possible.
He said,
Ours just isn't a great candidate for this. I imagine if you did this to all dinosaurs, estimated with traditional methods, they'd all change proportionally, but this just makes Dreadnoughtus shrink. I'm not exactly sure how Dreadnoughtus got involved.
In 2019, Gregory S. Paul published a study regarding the question of what the largest known land animal is and how to determine it. In this paper, he changed his previous Dreadnoughtus mass estimate to 31 tons, so a bit heavier than before. Paul states,
entirely analog, skillfully produced, high anatomical fidelity skeletal restorations and volumetric models representing a prime lean condition are approximately as scientifically objective and accurate, as well as more realistic than, analog digital crudely formed convex hull volumetric models, which are based on subjectively and often inconsistently or erroneously mounted skeletons and digitized skeletal reconstructions.
I don't know about that one way or the other, as I have no direct experience in these techniques, but there is clearly a continual back and forth on what is more or less objective, accurate, or precise. There will definitely be more techniques as time progresses. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, hit the bell icon for updates, like this video, and drop a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my elephant tier patrons: Arda Bayer, Biotiverse, Christoph Hubinger, Dinosaur, Isaiah Garza, P.A. Brew News, Ray, Rudy Redgrave, Smiling Walrus. And another thanks to my Tyrannosaurus tier patrons: Iberospinus, Iron Bladesman, Swaffles is Weird, Teeny Dragator, The Dogman.